Evening, everybody, and welcome along to this edition of LiR Confidential on lirmedia.tv and our usual email info@lirmedia.tv if you want to make a comment afterwards when this goes up on all our social media platforms and our YouTube channel. My special guest today, I'm really looking forward to it, is David Harris. Good evening, David. How do you do?
Good evening. I am great. And your good self?
I'm fantastic, David. Fantastic. Now, David Harris, for people who might be coming to him for the first time, he's a graduate of the University of Manchester. He grew up in England. You're now living in Israel, aren't you?
Correct, for the last 25 years.
Goodness, fantastic. Yeah. We'll get to that, but he's a public speaker, podcaster, writer, editor, journalist. I'm getting tired reading out all these things now, David, so I'll stop.
The truth is, I'm a jack of all trades, and probably my wife would say, and most of my bosses, a master of none.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you grew up in, as you were saying before we started, you grew up in Manchester, and was the media an attraction to you all the time, or how did you get started in it?
The media was an attraction to me the entire time, but I didn't realize it. I grew up with radio. I'm a big football fan. And in the old days of Radio 2, when Radio 2 carried sport, the UK radio, BBC Radio 2, before Radio 5 existed, I listened to all the commentaries. I listened to the boxing and whatever, but my real passion was the football. Commentators like Peter Jones, much later on, Alan Green, and a whole host of Irish commentators from both sides of the bordering island came along to broadcast on the BBC. And there was a magic to it. There was a picture being painted in your mind's eye. And much like a book, a lot of it is left to your imagination as opposed to the spoon feeding of television. So I didn't realize that it was going to form a career. When I was 11, 12 years old, I'd already decided I was going to be a barrister. I was going to be defending the innocent and putting away the good in the courts of the United Kingdom. And my career was headed in that direction. Every holiday I would work in law firms and barristers' chambers until I was 19. And I just didn't want to do it anymore. And I went to study law in Leeds for a year at the old Polytechnic, hated it, gave up, didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. And it was only completely by chance at that point that I fell into radio.
And of course, I agree with you, David. My first love, being the old fogey that I am, would be radio. And the idea of those commentators being able to paint a picture to go with the sound. That's like wonderful Peter O'Sullivan. His racing commentaries. Oh, God, was there ever a human being blessed with a voice like that?
Absolutely. And then you've got the magic of people in cricket in the UK. We had John Arlott, who would... between deliveries, instead of giving us what we get these days, which are packaged statistics and so on, would describe a passing cloud, or what the bus looked like and what the woman was wearing in her hat. And it was just magical. And I think that really inspired me, again, without me realizing at that stage.
So you were there. I mean, you were orientated towards, and I don't mean about your first break or anything, but when did you sit behind the microphone, so to speak, all by yourself and, gosh, this is it now?
After I finished with law, I went to Manchester University. I didn't have a clue what I was going to study, but my other real passion at the time and remains the Middle East. So I did Middle Eastern studies at the university, started with languages, found that a bit difficult. I'm not a linguist, moved more into the politics and the religion and so on. But I still didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to live in Israel at some point. I'm Jewish and it was a kind of thing. But there was an ad on a notice board in the student union for an open evening at the local independent radio station, Piccadilly Radio. And only two of us went. And at the end of the evening, I said to the news editor, John Pickford, would it be okay if I volunteered for a bit? Again, not thinking anything of it. Right. He liked the idea. Soon thereafter, I was producing the Sunday afternoon rugby league show. And then one day he said, okay, it's time. I want you to do a sports news report at the end of the day, just a 5-minute wrap of the day's news. So that was the first time. It was live. I was in a darkened booth. I could see the DJ on the other side of the window. We had our own little news booth. I was petrified, absolutely petrified. And in the old days, and there is an equivalent these days, but in the old days, there were things called carts. Imagine, blue plastic about this big cartridge with a reel inside it. And to the left of the microphone, there was a cart player, and there was a green button and a red button. And when you needed to play in a clip, so we would have something like Prime Minister Mrs. Thatcher says such and such, and then you hear Mrs. Thatcher's voice, you had to press that button. And I am so uncoordinated that I was absolutely convinced that I would hit the wrong button or manage to press 2 of the buttons. So you would have, Mrs. Thatcher and, I don't know, Indira Gandhi talking at exactly the same time. Thankfully, I didn't screw it up on the first occasion, but I did on many others. But that was my introduction, and it really was nerve-wracking.
And it's easier, looking back at myself, I've been involved in radio, mainly community radios all the time. And my first one was, I volunteered to do a jazz program, which I had never done because jazz is my thing. And they said, we have a slot, Pat, for you Saturday night from 10 o'clock to 12. My first time in the studio, but there was a great technical guy with me, Dave. If you're watching this, Dave, eternally grateful. Because I don't even know, if you asked me what I played and what I said, I couldn't tell you. But that's it, you learn on the job. And these community radios and these local radios are magnificent because you're in charge of your show, you're in charge of your program. And then that was the bug then, was Dave, that was your bug. That was your media you were in then.
Yeah, absolutely. And later I discovered I had a passion for making documentaries, audio documentaries. And at Piccadilly Radio, they were very much, here's your 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes of news, and that's it. The rest of it is phone in, chats and whatever. Right. And I had an idea for a 30-minute show, and the news editor said, we can't do that. I'll give you 10 minutes. There were 2 of us who were volunteering at the time, and it was coming up to Christmas, and we did a story about the homeless. And the whole point was, as we say about pets, the homeless aren't just for Christmas, they're for all the year. That was really the idea of it. But we put together a good interview. And on Christmas Eve, at the main homeless shelter in the middle of Manchester, there were dozens of people lined up outside, members of the public, with turkeys and potatoes and sweets and you name it, and blankets and everything. And that was because of the work that 2 volunteers had done at the local radio station, because people heard it, came and gave. And at that moment, that was when I understood the power of radio, or the power of the media. And that was only something, a small local effort, but that impacted on people's lives. And from that, I was able to grow into the bigger national, international scene, and understand that on the one hand, you can help. On the other hand, you've got to be phenomenally careful with the power that you possess.
Oh, absolutely, David. And my special guest is David Harris here on LiR Confidential on LiR Media. We're delighted to have David today. So then, did you go nationally, or how long did you stay around Britain for?
So I went to Preston, where I finished my studies and did a journalism course there, which was excellent, a 1-year postgraduate diploma. And various news editors would come and run news days as if we were in a real, grown-up newsroom, which was a lot of fun. And I built up really good relationship with a couple of them, and one of them offered me a job. And my first job was at BBC Radio Cumbria. And I worked in their Barrow-in-Furness office in the Southern Lakes. I lived on an island, Walney Island, 11 miles long, 1 mile wide, which was 2 nature reserves and 2 tiny villages, hamlets in the middle. And from my bedroom window, I could see the water that separated the island from the mainland, and beyond that, the mountains of the Lake District. So that was my introduction. And if you could find a news story in the Lake District, you could find a news story absolutely anywhere. And so I was there for 2 years, and then my second job, I moved over to Sunderland in the northeast of England. And that was the opposite. That was a scary place. There were many a story that I reported on that I don't want to say scared for my life, but I was certainly very concerned that violence could be headed in my direction, just because of the types of stories, the type of people. And I'm not coming down on people from Sunderland at all.
Oh, no.
But there was a violent element in that city and its surroundings that there wasn't in the Lake District. Right. So I did both of those for 2 years. I continued making documentaries. I also gave some of my time in the BBC's training unit, training other journalists on how to report local radio. And then I moved to Israel.
And how long are you in Israel now? 25 years, you said, was it?
Yeah, 25 years. It's quite a long time in a place like this.
In Jerusalem?
No, so I've always worked in Jerusalem, but these days I live in a town halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's called Modi'in, and it's near Ben Gurion Airport. It's 10 minutes from the airport.
Oh, that's very handy altogether.
Certainly is.
And where's David? He's gone.
So, well, actually, it's funny you should say that, because I haven't, like everybody else, I haven't traveled in, year and a half. And tomorrow morning, I'm off to the United Arab Emirates I have a podcast these days that I do for fun. So for the podcast, I'm off to the UAE, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Now, the media in Israel, and like the media in any small country, I mean, when I say Israel is a small country, Ireland, there's 4.9 million people, the Republic, and I suppose Israel, was that 6 or 7?
Well, I was probably about 8 by now.
Yeah, I remember there. Well, Haifa was around the area of Haifa where I spent, and walking down from Mount Carmel down David Ben Gurion Avenue to the coffee shops. David, is just, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. The smell of the coffee is just fantastic. It's better than the smell of the sea. I don't care what anyone says, But you're there in the media, obviously with the upsurge in hostilities again, or whatever you want to call them. We won't dwell it too long between Israel and Hamas. There seems to be peace now at the moment. What was it like in the town where you are, geographically or physically, when rockets? I suppose they wouldn't reach there, would they?
So let me just compliment you on one thing that you said in your introduction to that question, and then I'll answer your question. Because you said between Israel and Hamas. I think a lot of us are guilty of saying between Israel and the Palestinians. And obviously, in so many ways, I'm on the Israeli side. I have Israeli nationality. I live here. I'm a Zionist and proud to be so. But I think that quite often there is a tendency from those in the pro-Israel camp to sort of blame all the Palestinians, the same way that the international media seems to blame Israelis. But at least on the Israeli side, there is a government that we can say, and you can say Israel because it's the army and so on. So using the word Israel is fine. But on the other side, there are many, many innocent Palestinians, and you are absolutely right to blame Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the other terrorist elements that are turning their own territories into a war zone by their actions. To your question, we had, I think, three times we had to go into we call it a safe room. Imagine a bomb shelter in your house. This again shows the difference in many ways between Hamas and the Israelis. From the first Gulf War, a law was passed in Israel that said any new building in Israel must have bomb shelters inside individual homes because we want to protect our people. There are no bomb shelters in Palestinian homes. And so 3 occasions we ran. We've got a little dog. We're very lucky that my kids, I've got 2 kids. One is 21, one is almost 19. My wife, who has disabilities, and myself, but we were able to quickly get into our safe room. We hear a siren, and because of our distance, we are 80 kilometers, 50 miles from Gaza. So we had a minute and a half to get into our safe room, seal it, close the door, and so on. But the people who live the closest, have 15 seconds of a warning. And if you can imagine, you know, a single mum with 3 young kids,
Yeah.
how does she decide which of her children she's going to pick up? Does she pick up the baby? Which of them does she run to their bedroom to wake them up? You know, they say in the area around Gaza in Israel, you very, very rarely see a woman in high heels because they're all wearing running shoes because they never know when they need to run.
You know, these are the small things and the important things that people forget at the time, you know. And I think myself, it's not. I was blessed that I was in Israel, but I'm just saying people don't have to go there. But nevertheless, they should inform themselves, David. And the ignorance in a lot of the media is astonishing. Even in our own parliament, I won't mention the names on this show, but we intend to do one ourselves. The contributors, you can go online and look at it in our Dáil Éireann and Shannon Éireann, our 2 houses, the upper and lower house, were, in my mind, shameful to be Irish. Listen to some of them. I'm not painting all politicians as the same, but there's enough of them there to bring shame in our country. But I'm just getting back to the conflict. Walking around Israel, Israel contains Jews, Arabs, Palestinians, Marsh Arabs, Druze. I don't have to tell you, it's a huge mix of people getting on with their lives, educating their children, running their little coffee shops, running their antique shops, like you and I are in a normal situation. And I'll tell you that I'm not saying the state of Israel is not blameworthy in a few things that happened. I'm not going to excuse that at all. But my first awareness of Israel was the 1967 war with the wonderful Moshe Dayan with the patch over the eye. That was my first picture of learning the history. But you have to inform yourself, David. And there is, I dare say, even in, I hate using the word because mainstream media, there's huge amount of ignorance in mainstream media. You have people, I don't have to tell you, you have NBC and CNN and all of them over there reporting nonsense half the time. How do you, in the media, cope with that yourself?
So I first of all, on a very personal level, and I don't know if people agree with me or not over here, I talk about it occasionally, but I try not to talk politics.
Yes, yeah.
But
yeah.
I don't think that the media that you're referring to, that the journalists wake up in the morning and think, I hate Israel, I need to bash Israel. What I think has happened over the last 30 years, 40 years, is that a narrative has been built up and has become accepted. And there are certain adjectives that we subconsciously attach to individuals, to news stories. Just for example, if you see an overweight woman with rosy cheeks who is a good singer, the adjective you are likely to use for her is something like jolly. You know, that's jolly is a word for a plump, happy person.
Yes.
And that becomes the narrative that is accepted. So when a young journalist, say someone in their 30s, who has only ever known a term like occupier attached to Israel, that is their norm. They don't think in the morning, is Israel the bad guy or the good guy? They know in their hearts Israel is an occupying power and that is a wrong thing and we need to bash it. Which means that they don't know the context, they don't know the history, they've never thought for themselves, they are just buying into what they have been told, which is extremely problematic.
Yeah. I don't think, I'm telling you myself, my own opinion, and I'm not saying this because of the age I am. I don't think any journalist worth their salt, male or female, under the age of 45 should be reporting anything like that.
Agreed. Absolutely agree with you. But that's the reality that we face, you know? I'll give you another, for example, it's a completely different world. I'm from Manchester. From the age of 6, I've supported Manchester City. in football.
Oh my God! If I knew that, I wouldn't have phoned you. I know.
That's exact. That kind of is exactly the point. You know, there was the old joke of the English fan goes into a bar in Spain, in Mexico, doesn't matter where, and people would say, "Oh, Bobby Charlton." So I have had. I'm almost 55, so whatever that is, 48 years of people saying, when I say I'm from Manchester, oh, Manchester United. It is a bought into narrative that upsets me intensely.
Like Somerby or anything like that, you know.
Yeah, good knowledge. But I know I'm cheapening the issue, which is a very serious, very heavy issue.
No,
but it makes the point.
Absolutely. And we won't dwell on that too much. I mean, it is sad. And as I said, it's sad. I think the majority of people in Israel, and there's no doubt in my mind, when I went around to buy my meat in the butcher shop in Haifa from the Arab family that ran it, I mean, just fantastic. They were just running that butcher shop and all. I think ordinary people, I don't mean denigrating, ordinary people, the mass of people in Israel, the mass of Palestinian people do not want this carry on for themselves.
Absolutely.
How would they? You know, how would they?
At the end of the day, all of us on this planet, all 8 billion of us, or however many there are right now, want two things. We want health and we want financial stability. That's all we care about, because with those comes everything else. If you can provide for your family, if you can provide for your society, if you are well and healthy, you put your efforts into working the land, or in these days, the working the land equivalent is high tech over here. And you deal with those things, and everybody has a nice living, and you don't have the situations that we had. All of this kicked off. Again, we don't need to go into the who started it and who didn't start it. But what happened was there were a group in Jerusalem of lads without employment, Arab lads without employment, who were gathering. They didn't have anything to do. The police tried to move them on. The Jewish Israeli police tried to move them on. I shouldn't say Jewish police. The Israeli police force has in it Christians and Muslims and Druze and so on. But they tried to move them along. The Arab kids took exception to it. Battle started. Hamas thought, whoa, this is a really good idea. If we lob in a few rockets, we can create division between these people. And that's how it all started. It was a group of lads with no jobs, didn't have anything to do on their evenings, having fasted all day during Ramadan, and then trouble started. If you deal with those things, you know, if the Palestinian Authority and Hamas cared more about building up their economy, using the international aid and help that comes from Israel, instead of using that to build the bunkers, to build tunnels, to cut down traffic lights and turn them into rockets, which is what they do. There's a reason there's no lamp light in Gaza. It's because they've all been cut down, because they're hollow tubes to make those rockets. If you invest in those things instead, the Palestinians would have had a state decades ago, and we would be in a completely different place now. And Israel wouldn't be being blamed by the international media, but everybody would be hunky-dory. And the same way that Israel has now developed phenomenal relationships with Jordan and Egypt, and of late with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and probably very soon with Saudi Arabia, Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria, we should be doing that, and could be doing that, with our immediate neighbors, the Palestinians.
Yeah, my special guest is David Harris here on LiR Confidential. Now, David, I think there must be some credit before we leave that section given to Donald Trump for those particular accords, you know, that Israel signed with the UAE and the other countries.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't highlighted enough in the press, myself speaking. Look, well, we can all like or dislike people's style and everything like that, but I'll tell you one thing I admired Trump for. He wasn't a politician, everybody knew that. So he didn't have the baggage. He didn't have the political baggage that other people might have of 30 or 40 years as a politician. But, I mean, he took chances like a businessman would, because he'd gone up and down. He went to the Korean Peninsula. Now, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with Donald Trump that he went to the Korean Peninsula. There was a harmony between North and South. There was some kind of understanding, a better understanding built up. And then the accord with the Arab countries, I think myself that was the basis for huge stability. I'm not saying that if Donald Trump was in power today, that this conflict, latest flare up, would have happened, but I'm just saying there'd be a different approach to it, I dare say, David. You know?
So on Trump, I didn't like him, but I absolutely agree with you on the Accords, and also not just the relationship with the Koreas, but also I think he tried with Russia. He might not have done it in a way that we think is fitting, especially given all the allegations. I think he tried damned hard with China, but because of who he was, he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. And that was a crying shame. And I'll tell you something else. And again, I am not a Trump fan. I've gone out of focus. I'm not a Trump fan. But I was so upset with the left in America about one thing. The day after he was elected, democratically elected. You can argue whether you think the system's a good system or not, but he was democratically elected by the rules of the United States. There were people demonstrating on the streets of the United States. And my problem with that was they were demonstrating against democracy, against the system that they believe in, that they, take the pledge, put their hands on the heart and say, this is what we believe in. Accept the result. Then you give Donald Trump 100 days of grace, which is what is accepted in most Western democracies. And if by that time he's messed up, go out on the streets and demonstrate, not violently. Don't go into, the Capitol Hill and break it. Exercise your democratic right to protest, but give the man a chance. And the media on the left and the general democratic voting public in America never did. And I definitely say that that was an unfair thing. Again, I am not a Trump fan, but I think that was wrong.
I mean, you comment on what is actual fact, which is always good anyway, David. And before we leave Donald Trump, I mean, the thing he did it's been on the books in the United States for years about Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now, people from afar, I don't have to tell you, people from afar looking at this later on, may not think there's huge significance in that. That was an incredibly significant act that he did. And Obama before him didn't do it. Clinton before him didn't do it. The Bushes didn't do it. He did it. And did that had, I think, a huge emotional effect on the state of Israel, I dare say.
It could have been an incredibly foolish move in hindsight, because there was a risk with it. Yes. The risk that could have happened, and his gamble paid off. You talked about him being a businessman. It was a massive gamble. We could have seen riots across the Muslim world, not just in the Middle East, but in volatile countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Malaysia. We could have seen riots like we've never seen before, where Muslims would have killed Muslims because police officers would have been, out there on the streets. And it didn't happen. I'm assuming that before he made the announcement that his people in the State Department talked to the leaders of those types of countries that I mentioned and to gauge sentiment there. In the end, it's passed by quietly. The amount of protest was very minimal. I was surprised because I thought it was going to be a disaster. And I would say credit to him for having just the guts to go out there and do it. And like you said, in terms of knowing that the United States is behind Israel, knowing that now if we need to do anything as members of the public with America, my two kids are American, we're in the middle of renewing their passports. We go up to the embassy in Jerusalem and it's wonderful. It's a great, it really is a great feeling.
Yeah. My special guest is David Harris here on LiR Confidential with myself, Pat Barry. Now, David, we can't skip over your wonderful week-long trek to Kappa White. Now, I'm not saying now, before we go any further now, I'm not denigrating Cap White. It's only out the road from where we were broadcasting from here. But what connection have you with Cap White?
Absolutely none whatsoever. So the summer before I moved to Israel, so that would be 95, the summer of 95.
Yeah.
With another 3 friends. In my single days, I was what, 28 or 29.
Right.
We said we were going to go to Ireland for a week's holiday, and we had a choice. We wanted to do a holiday where we really travelled around. So we could either we're going to rent a car. We could either drive around the outside of the country and just each night stop in a different place, or we could center ourselves in one place and then just like the spokes of a wheel go in a different direction each day. Yes. So we sort of put a pin in a map of Ireland as close to the center as we could. And it came out in Cap White. And
my goodness.
Yeah, for those who don't know, at least the way I remember it in those days, it's a village of about 200 people, 1 church and 7 pubs. Yeah. That was the way I remembered it. And it was a mystery how the pub stayed in business, because there were sort of 2 regulars in each bar, each night.
You had a pub though for each night.
But I'll tell you a couple of quick stories about it. One making fun of the place. We went to, gosh, I'm trying to think, one of the castles over on the west. And we were in the dungeon. There was a tea room. They converted it into a tea room, and this buxom woman behind the bar says to us, "Hello there, boys. What can I get you?" And we said, "Oh, we'll have a cup of tea, please. That's very nice." And she's, forgive the accent, I know it's terrible. And she says, "Where are you all from then?" So we said, "Well, we're from Manchester, or we study in Manchester, or work in Manchester, whatever it was." She says, "And where are you staying?" And we said, "We're staying in Cap White." And she says, "Cap White? What on earth do you want to be staying there for? There's nothing there." So that was sort of the negative on Cap White. But I'll tell you something amazingly positive about that town and that village, and I haven't had an experience anywhere else since.
Right.
And I like to think that it's still that way. It was Sunday evening, and the 4 of us were going for a walk around the village before we went off to the pub. And I happened to notice on our left-hand side, somebody had left a key in a front door. So I walked down the pathway and was about to knock on the door when a neighbor from the adjoining house popped their head out and said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I've seen there's a key in the door over there, and I wanted to just knock on and tell them." They said, "Oh, don't worry about that. It's Mrs. O'Donnell. She's an old lady, and she can't get out. And all of us in the village look after her. We bring her shopping. We'll help with the gardening, whatever she needs. We'll help her walk about her home if she needs it." And so the key was left in the front door.
That's astonishing.
Wouldn't it be this is not that long ago, this is 95.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing if in Dublin and Manchester and Jerusalem and Washington, that we could all trust one another enough to do something as wonderful and simple as that.
Isn't that's an astonishing thing. I remember growing up in the country. There were 9 of us in the family, but we had the old half doors in Ireland, Mm-hmm. So there was always a welcome no matter where you went. And everybody was there to keep an eye on everybody else around, So it's a great idea. That's a fantastic story. Well, Cap White has left an indelible mark on David, and it's good for tourism, lads. So will you be looking at this here in Cap White? Give a bula bus to David Harris, our special guest here on LiR Media today. And David, you were involved with the Jerusalem Post, mm-hmm. and you're a podcaster. Did you do a travel podcast as well?
So back when I was at the Jerusalem Post, this is from 96 to 2001, mm-hmm. we became the first newspaper in the world to do what these days you would call a podcast, but was internet radio in those days. So it wasn't 24/7 broadcasting. We would record news clips, put them up onto the internet, another news clip, and you could listen to them streaming one after another. So we were the first to do that. We beat the Washington Post by about 6 months. And I've always loved radio and always kept in radio, even though I moved more into newspaper reporting and now the non-profit world. I started a few years ago with a very good friend doing some football reporting for an Israeli internet radio station, but we did European football, mainly England, but we'd look at other leagues all over Europe as well. And then a couple of years ago, we launched something called the Almost 30-Minute News Quiz, which was just a fun satirical look at what was happening in the news.
Yeah.
But we weren't getting many listeners because it was just my friend Mark and me. So we'd have 80 people, 100 people listening to each episode. And we were putting a lot of effort into it. And we thought, you know what, why don't we get a bigger audience? So a few months ago, I went back to my alma mater, the Jerusalem Post, and I said to them, we'd like to do a travel and tourism podcast. Are you interested? And they said, your timing is perfect because we're just building out a whole series of podcasts and it fits right in there. And we started talking to them maybe 8 months ago, 7 months ago, which was a bit early given everything that was going on with COVID. But it took 3-4 months to get things together, and then we could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And we launched in February of this year a travel and tourism podcast, which, forgive me, I'll do my link. You can get it at jpost.com/podcast. And we look at travel and tourism around the world. We do most of it with just a very general look at travel and tourism. We have a couple of guests on each time, tour guides, hoteliers, chefs, unless, as with the case, I said to you, we're flying off to the UAE tomorrow, to the Emirates, where we'll do a special ourselves just from the Emirates. It's predominantly, as I said, generic. But there's two things that we do that are a little bit different, and we keep them in brief, but because we're with the Jerusalem Post, we do this. One is we always do something of a slightly Jewish element, so we'll throw in where you can get kosher food, or if there's something of particular Jewish history in a town. So, going to southern Spain, looking at how the Jews lived there in the 900s. And the other thing is, because we've got a lot of Christian Zionist listeners and readers of the Jerusalem Post, so we'll throw in things that are also of a Christian interest as well. And obviously here in Israel, you can't move more than 10 yards without finding something of both Christian and Jewish heritage.
That is very true, and we look up that we put up the links after we're finished anyway, David. I have them all down here in my piece of paper anyway. I'm a one sheet man, like a famous politician would say. I'm a one sheet man. Anything after that, I don't want to know about it. Our special guest is David Harris here on LiR Confidential on LiRmedia.tv. You broke the story over 20 years ago now. And I'm going to refer to now this. What did that? I'm not even going to attempt. I was practicing attempting ASSI, but I said I gave up. I have to be honest with people looking at this. Some of them say I pretend all the time, but I cannot say the word properly. But you know what I mean.
Yeah. You say you're referring. Do you want me to tell the whole story, or should I just say the name?
You could say the name first, and we can ask you about it then.
Okay. Assicurazioni Generali.
That's the one. The Generali is fine. I'm fine with that word.
Most people around the world just refer to it as Generali, and there's probably a very good reason.
We could see the reason. I was practicing, and I said to me, look, forget about it. Look, you're never going to say it when you're under pressure, to say it, But what was that about for people who may be coming to it for the first time,
As I said earlier on, there was a time at which I realized that journalists have an incredible power. And I would say, in terms of things that I was able to change as a journalist, this is by far the number one for me.
Yeah.
During the Second World War, when Jews and Gypsies and others were being taken to the death camps, and they were being killed, What happened to their insurance, their life policies? Because there was no death certificate. So you were killed in Auschwitz. What were your family going to do? And so I met somebody who had life policies with the Assicurazioni Generali, which was based in Trieste in northeastern Italy, which of course was also problematic because the Italians sided with the Nazis during the war.
Yeah.
The daughter of the man in the story who was killed went to Assicurazioni Generali and they said, "Where is your death certificate?" And she said, "I don't have one." And they said, "You can't have your money." So that's the basic story. So over a period of 2 years, I researched this with the grandchild of the man in the story.
Yeah.
We dug up letters and papers and policies, not necessarily that person's policies, and we dug up all sorts of things. Eventually, some of the largest Jewish organizations in the world joined us in the campaign. And at the end of it, Assicurazioni Generali, to their credit, became the first insurance company in the world, and there was a lot of coverage of the banks at the time, but became the first insurance company in the world to pay up. But they didn't necessarily pay to individuals. They paid to the Jewish world. They paid compensation, which was then given to survivors and organizations that are helping poor Jews around the world. And our initial payment from Generali was $12 million, but that was followed very, very soon by a series of other major insurance houses around Europe who paid substantial sums. And we were able to give a much better life to some very poor people who were, survivors, maybe without family, alone, and it totally changed their lives. And to have been a part of that, small part of that, I was very proud.
And David, we're talking about life insurance policies, aren't we?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, and obviously one of the requirements is having a death certificate. But as you know, I don't think the SS were going to issue a death certificate for David Harris, exactly. In Auschwitz, which was a stupid approach by the company. There was a film made on one of the agents, one of the main sellers of these insurance policies in Europe at the time. Now he was selling with the knowledge of what was happening already, if you follow my drift. But anyway, I forget the name of the film, people. But I mean, that's people forget. I won't say forget. I haven't been to Auschwitz yet. I intended to go this year, but I'll wait now till next year. My brother and people have been there, but I haven't been there myself. We watched, I'll tell you, I know we're saying a bit. A few of us watched the other night again, for something to do. We watched Schindler's List again because of Liam Neeson and Ralph Fiennes, because we were trying to contact a relation of Eamon Goth, the guy, but we got through anyway. But we decided to watch the film. When you revisit a film, there are so many horrific things that you become used to in the film that you miss, if you follow my drift, that you miss the savagery of it. But anyway, that was, by the way, the Schindler's List, a magnificent film. It should be on every leaving cert course in Ireland, and whatever your high school thing is there as one of the things to watch when they're studying history, in my opinion. So that was your story that you'll be forever with, David. That's the insurance payout for people who had been murdered and slaughtered in those death camps. And really, when I was in Israel myself, I met 2 survivors. They're dead now since, just a good few years. I met them. I didn't know who they were. I didn't speak Hebrew, obviously, and to 3 other gentlemen who I got to know from going to the same coffee shop every morning. They were sitting in the same place, and they saw this white man, Snow White, going into the coffee shop. One of them shalom one morning, and he spoke English. There were 3 veterans from the army, and they were staying in one of those places for them. And I got to know them, and we had some magnificent chats, and I corresponded with them later and all of that. But that's just fantastic to meet people like that. But they introduced me to these 2 gentlemen, and and we were chatting away, but there's, I don't know how to describe it, but there is a huge difference between you and I and survivors of horror like that. When you speak to them, it's nothing to do with revenge or anything like that. It's to do with this appalling thing that they witnessed. I can't put it into words, but it was just, anyway, their souls rest in peace anyway. David, you're involved as well, as if you didn't have enough to do. As I said, I was breathless in the start. I didn't read out everything that he's involved in. The Hadassah. What is the Hadassah public relations? What is Hadassah? What does it do?
Hadassah.
Sorry, Hadassah.
That's okay. It's almost as bad as assicurazioni.
Yeah, and I never said that. You said that.
I'll try to get you to say it before the end of the show. Hadassah is an interesting story. These days, Hadassah is known as a hospital. It also has a couple of schools for disadvantaged kids, mainly from Israel, but also brings in kids from around the world who are disadvantaged and helps them. So we're a charity. We're an American organization. We date back to 1909.
Oh dear, I know. And where is it located?
Jerusalem. We're two hospitals. There are 3 hospitals in Jerusalem. 2 of them are Hadassah. We're the main hub. So the thing that we're outside of medicine that we're most famous for is, have you heard of the Chagawa Windows? As in, yeah. So the Chagawa Windows, which are the 12 sons of Jacob, are in our hospital by Marc Chagall, the famous French artist.
My goodness.
So we get thousands of people until Corona. We got thousands of people coming through every year just to see the windows, which are actually right across from my little office. But the organization was set up over 100 years ago, 110 years ago, because when the first Jewish people, the pioneers, were moving to this country, there wasn't medical care, not for Arabs who were living here, not for the Jews. And the first big problem they had was glaucoma. And so this small organization was formed in America by women. It's a women's organization. They had sort of, gatherings of ladies drinking tea, and they did sponsored events and whatever was, in vogue in the 1910s, raffles or whatever, raised some money and were able to bring 2 nurses over to Jerusalem, and they started treating the glaucoma. And from there it developed, and we're now the 2nd largest employer in Jerusalem. We have 5,000 staff, 3,000 nurses, 1,000 doctors, and we are performing some of the most pioneering medicine in the world. And obviously with everything that just happened with COVID, we were really at the cutting edge of what was being done in Israel. And Israel, of course, was at the cutting edge of what's been done around the world over the last year. There are many things that we did that nobody else was doing. They worked, and they've just been adopted around the world. In fact, colleagues of mine just came back from Argentina. They met the Argentinian government, which had reached out to our hospital to say, you know what, we really, really need your help. And there are many other stories like that around the world.
So, I mean, in Ireland, would those Hadassah hospitals be described as voluntary hospitals?
It's a hybrid hospital.
Right.
Because there is some government funding, but we are also we're a charity, so it's a kind of mix.
Yeah.
I don't know how the health system works in Ireland. Forgive me.
What I'm getting at is if people had no money, they'd be treated. That's
Absolutely.
That's what I mean.
Absolutely. First of all, in Israel, there is no such concept whatsoever as there is in, say, the United States of not being able to access medical care because of your financial situation. But we have a very well organized system where we have something called health funds. Basically, whether you are earning or not earning, it's a little bit like the NHS in the UK, and whether you're earning or not earning, contributions go from you to health funds, These 4 health funds run their own health services. So you've got local clinics, mother and child, basic surgeries and so on. And then you have access to the hospitals as well off the back of it. If you have the means, there are some things that you might have to pay for, but by and large, you are going to get your treatment pretty much free.
You're going to get your treatment, which is the bottom line, and the worries for people as they get older, exactly. like myself. You'll be, it's always in the back of your head, because like a motor car when it gets old, that's it. As bits fall off and bits stop working and all of that.
And also, if I can mention, because we started this whole conversation talking about peace and so on. Let me just tell you 2 things. One, our employees are from every describable, imaginable background. We have all of the cultures and races and religions of Israelis. We also have doctors from around the world who come and work with us because of our reputation, and then they go back and have learned their skills and perform practice in Nepal, in Nigeria, in Eastern Europe, and in the rest of the world as well. But on top of that, just in terms of something really interesting, medicine in the Middle East is not as developed as it is in the West. In general, even in some of those advanced countries, the medicine is not as developed. What we have been able to do in our hospital, because we have a fairly large Arab population and Jews from the Middle East and Jews from all sorts of places around the world, is develop one of the world's largest genetic banks. So we have got the genes of people from all around the world, and the research that we are doing on those genes is really frontline, and we are able to save people's lives in Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Yemen, and all of these countries that we don't necessarily have relations with, because we have the genetic data to help them and to get over the. In this part of the world, we're still at the stage where a lot of cousins marry cousins, and so there are those genetic issues, and we are rewriting the genetic map of people in the Middle East by helping them, by informing them, and by performing life-saving testing and so on. And so those genetic diseases, slowly, of course, we are not the answer, but we're helping to slowly eradicate some genetic diseases with our work.
That's true. And you mentioned Yemen there. Is the war still going on there? Is that's, I know it's not much of it, but it's still horrific. Did you get to help out there as well, as you said, in Yemen? And there's anyway, there's conflicts. I suppose it would be almost impossible to react to every conflict, but I know Israel did a lot around the world and has got recognition for it as well, particularly with their humanitarian aid, both medically and food-wise as well, and all of that, David. So it's worthwhile acknowledging that, David Harris is with us here on LiR Confidential on LiRmedia.tv. Now, I mentioned down here you had some input, or what's the word? What I'm looking for, the Chinese. Are you a bit of an expert, or did you study the Chinese news agency Xinhua, whatever?
You're picking up all the hard ones to say. Yeah. It's Xinhua, which means Xinhua is the Chinese news agency, the official Chinese news agency. Xinhua means New China.
Let's be cynical here now, David, for 1 minute. The official Chinese news agency.
I know.
That's like looking at a cartoon, to my mind, or Disneyland.
So much to my chagrin, I worked for them for a couple of years.
Oh, you did?
But it was very, very interesting. So, because, as you say, official news agency, I had to almost educate my Chinese colleagues who were based here to try to help them. First of all, there was the issue of really understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And they didn't have the type of background that you were talking about. So I worked a lot on that.
All right.
What was interesting was that there were certain stories that they didn't want me to cover. For example, and they had me as their Middle East analyst. That was what I was doing. But they didn't want me to write about Iran, because of sensitivities. The question I have for you is, how on earth can you be a Middle East analyst and not write about Iran?
It's like being a Jewish analyst, not writing about Israel. It's
Right.
madness.
Right. So I had to be very careful where I trod. I wrote very carefully. I didn't write anything that I didn't believe in, but I was always aware that the material wasn't just being looked at journalistically, but was also being looked at from a very particular political viewpoint, which I find problematic. And I don't just find that problematic with the Chinese. I find that problematic with all media outlets. We shouldn't have to have a Fox versus CNN battle. If everybody reports the news truthfully and as accurately as we can, and I know news is always going to be subjective.
Yeah, but I know what you mean, David,
Yeah.
and it's just shocking to me, this A versus B, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I respect all journalists at face value. I take them at face value, but as soon as, I don't know what it is, would you consider China one of the most dangerous countries in the world today? The regime.
Look, I think the arming of China is definitely problematic, the same way the arming of Russia was, and I would throw into there Iran. Do we in the West fully understand the Chinese? Have we in the West ever made a real effort to understand? I don't know. Maybe we have, maybe we haven't. I don't know enough. But that part of the world is incredibly volatile. China's expansionist policies into, and I'm not going to talk about the Korean Peninsula, I'm not even going to mention it. China's policies, expansionist, interventionist policies in, for example, Africa, that we in the West largely don't know about.
They're buying all the ports, they're buying airports, they're buying accessibility. I was looking at the program research, it's shocking.
And all of the African countries roll over because of the short-term gain. If the Chinese say, we will give you the best roads in Africa, in your country, we'll build a superhighway, we will give you train lines, you know, we'll even build cities for you. All you need to give us is access to lithium, right? Lithium is in all of our batteries. In all of our phone batteries, there is lithium. Imagine if you can control the lithium market.
That's it. Communications.
Yeah, you control everything. So they, you know what? Are they dangerous? I don't know. Are they clever? Absolutely. Are they playing the long game brilliantly? Absolutely. And we, the West, the good guys, the heroes, the Democrats, we're playing the game very, very poorly and losing.
We do, because, I mean, it's a long time since Richard Nixon became the first US president to China in 1970, I think, wasn't it? All those, I remember it was a huge, big thing, mate. 50, was it?
Yeah.
51 years ago, my goodness me. But anyway, look, we're not speaking about the Chinese people in case people are coming.
Absolutely.
We're speaking about the Communist Party running the countries. That's what we're talking about, really. Like, when we're speaking about Hamas, we're not speaking about the Palestinian people either. We're speaking about a small minority, a dangerous minority. That's what we're doing. And so, how long did you stay with them for, David?
A couple of years.
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you and say at that time.
And did you speak Chinese?
No, not a word. They translated my material into Chinese, and my material has probably been read by more people than most household name journalists in the world, because my market was 1.6 billion people. Because they were the official news agency, it got into every single newspaper, every TV show, and so on.
Absolutely, absolutely. Have you been to China?
No, the closest I've got is Japan.
Right. Oh, yeah, it's a lovely country, actually. I know friends of mine from Japan, yeah. But that was interesting. And so you're back now. Your present job or your present association now is in the hospital, and that's what you do. How do you find that work yourself? I mean, you're still a young man. You'll probably do something else later on, do you think?
But let's see. But if my boss is watching this, I've got to be very careful what I say. But at the moment, I'm very happy here. Look, it's a deeply, deeply rewarding place to work. There's a lot of tragedy, and there are many, many stories in our hospital and in every other hospital that don't end well. You know, you just need to look at COVID to understand that. On the other hand, the phenomenal stories we have of giving life, whether it's in the maternity ward or saving a life, it is just tremendous. I'll give you one quick story. I met a doctor last week, professor. She's an oncologist, and she is basically taking leukocytes from our white blood cells, taking them out, re-engineering them. This is for people with multiple myeloma, which is a non-curable disease. She's taking out their blood cells, their leukocytes, re-engineering them, putting them back in, and we're at the clinical test stage. But she believes that we in our hospital will be able, you can never cure this disease, but we can turn it into a chronic illness.
A manageable disease.
A manageable disease. She took me to, at the moment, they've got 7 patients on the clinical trial. She took me to the room where they are taking out the leukocytes. People are hooked up to centrifuges, which take their blood, separate the blood into white and red and plasma, pop in all the bits that they don't need back into the body, and they take out the leukocytes. And I sat with a woman. And this woman, I later saw her picture when she was healthy. She's been dealing with this for 15 years on and off. She looked at death's door. You know, in my head, I'm thinking, you know what, maybe it's better if this woman does die because she's suffered for so long. Look at her, she's pathetic, she's pitiful. And the professor said to me after we left the room, she said, that woman has young children. If all we do is give those children and that mother another 2-3 years together, then every penny of the millions of dollars that we put into this project has been worthwhile. And she believes that they are going to be able to let that woman live for many years if this works. And that, for me, I'm in the public relations side. I am shouting and screaming about that story. It makes my job easy because we're looking for donations, you know, in the United States. We're a nonprofit there. When people hear a story like that, they will open their wallets and purses and give. And that's wonderful.
And I'd love, might get to talk to her sometime, David, with yourself. It'd be nice to speak to someone like that because we don't hear, I mean, just obviously huge stories like that. We don't hear good stories enough of them anyway, you know. It's as easy to talk about the bombs and bullets.
Hang on a minute. Sorry. It's not just about Israel. We don't hear enough good stories in the news in general. I think, again, I'm going back to the UK, forgive me. On the news at 10, when I grew up, they always used to do an "and finally." And they used to say, "and finally," and it was always a good news story, which meant that for 28 minutes of a 30-minute show, they've been bombarding us with heart-wrenching stuff that depresses you. What is wrong with you? Well, what is wrong with turning around to the news editors or the news editors changing the way we deal with news and saying, you know what, yes, we do have to report when there's a disaster, but why can't we put the good news in there at the top of this show as well and make people feel good about who we are as a human race?
Exactly. Why can't we put the story with the key in the door from Kappa Wife, top of the news, and finish off with us as well? You know, gosh, that story still resonates with me, David. Even just that story was enough to be speaking to you for over an hour, believe it or not. But what's your hope now as well for the I hate coming back to, but since you live there now, since it's your home, are you optimistic about some kind of a settlement between Palestinians and Israel? What's going on there? Is there talks going on?
So I'm sure behind closed doors, maybe not this week, but I know the Secretary of State of the United States, Blinken, was over here yesterday. He met with the Israeli side, the Palestinian side. I think we have to, as you indicated before, we kind of have to separate between the people and the politicians. I think most people on both sides, deep in their hearts, want it. You know what? The politicians want it as well. We all remember, or those people who've lived here, you know, for many years, remember Israelis driving into Gaza and going to the markets there. We know of, you know, people from Gaza coming to our hospital for treatment. This was standard only 25 years ago, something like that, maybe 30 years ago. We can go back to that. I think the details of the peace deal, whenever it comes, are less important than the will. It's about the will. And I think both sides, and I don't know if this is going to hurt you and your listeners, your viewers, but both sides have to, in many ways, put aside history. Yes, it is the promised land. Yes, there was an Arab presence here for many, many years. Yeah. But we need to say, what is the reality in 2021? How do we make the 12 million people that live between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River live together in peace and harmony? How do we achieve that? And if we have to shake things up and say, okay, the settlers are in the West Bank now, and we're not going to move hundreds of thousands of settlers out of that area, what can we do as an alternative? How can we give the Palestinians something else instead that they will be happy with, that will be at least equal to what we're taking away, and vice versa? And I think that has to be the approach. And if both sides were to adopt that, we could have peace here within 6 months.
Well, David, it's been a blast having you along. We'll certainly have to bother you again. Don't worry, we'll bother you again to come on. But and I wholeheartedly agree with what you said there about the two sides, both Jews and Palestinian people. They want to just live their lives like you and I, go down to the shop, go down to the pub or cafe or whatever it is, and educate their children, for God's sake. Just get on with it, lads, we'd say, echo yourself. David Harris, from this edition of LiR Confidential, it's been an absolute joy to have you along. And as I said, we will have you along again. And that's a promise to you as well. And I will see, can I find that lady with the key in the door to Cap of White between now and the next time. But anyway, David, thank you very much for taking the time out of your very, very busy life, busy day. And best wishes to you, the job you're in. Tell your family, stay safe. And from myself, Pat Barry, and all of us here on LiR Media, shalom, David Harris.
Shalom to you too, and thank you for your time.